Let us now zoom into some of the more concrete examples of security challenges in the region. And here we go. Of course, North Korea. Well, North Korea represents indisputably the greatest security challenge for Japan, and that is the case for now almost over the past 3 decades. As you all know, it is a rock state in every sense of the term, with some of the most unpredictable military regimes in the world that is, on top of everything, in possession of a nuclear weapon. It is also a country that is technically at war with the United States, which it considers occupies its South Korean neighbor for now 70 years. So in a way, the presence of US forces on Japanese territory further exposes Japan to a potential North Korean attack. The regular tests of its ballistic missile arsenal, which often overfly the Japanese territory, constitutes the main immediate security concerns, and we will talk about it right after this. But it is not the only concern in the relationship between Japan and North Korea. There are issues, historical issues, such as the abductions. If you have never heard about the abduction issues, it is a story pretty much taken out of a James Bond movie, really. It is a story about the Japanese citizen being abducted by the North Korean regime at the end of 1970s and beginning 80s to be taken into North Korea and trained as spies. Although there are officially 17 reported cases of those citizens today, we can assume that the number of victims has been higher than that. And the problem is that North Korea refuses to recognize the issue and cooperate with Japan or even give news of what these Japanese citizens have become. The issue has become extremely sensitive for the Japanese population, and its clarification remains very high on Japan's political agenda and keeps being put on the agenda in Japan's every dealing with North Korea, either bilaterally or within multilateral frameworks. Now, of course, the North Korean nuclear and ballistic missile program is of greatest security concern. Japan is located in the immediate vicinity of North Korea, so every launch test puts the Japanese population potentially at risk. While most of the missiles have been conducted or launched in the Sea of Japan, quite a few actually, some of the long-range ones, overfly the Japanese territory, much to the anxiety of the local population. The peak of tensions has been achieved in 2017 with 17 of such tests conducting, out of which 2 overflew the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido in August and September 2017. As you know, the tensions have been partly diffused in 2018 with the Winter Olympic Games in Seoul and the subsequent summits with the United States, but we are still far from any serious or sustainable breakthrough on the Korean Peninsula. As a matter of fact, the missile test continues, and the last one have been conducted just in March 2020. While North Korea represents arguably the greatest security threat, Japan's relationship with other neighbors are not completely smooth either. With Russia, it is still de facto legally at war, as the 2 countries never signed a peace treaty after the end of the Second World War. The reason for that has been their unresolved sovereignty disputes in the southern part of the Kuril archipelago, called as the Northern Territories by Japan and the Southern Kurils by Russia. We are talking of 4 small islands, namely Etorofu, Kunashiri, Shikotan, and Habomai in Japanese, that are today administered by Russia. In fact, Russia even has a military base on those islands. And of course continues to be claimed by Japan and continue to pose a problem in their diplomatic relations. The latest solution or proposition put on the table by Russia in 2001 is called the so-called 2+2 solution, which proposes to Japan to keep the two small islands, Habomai and Shikotan, and for Russia to keep the two big ones of Kunashir and Iturup. It has never been accepted so far, but we can say that besides this territorial dispute, the bilateral relationship with Russia is evolving. The economic cooperation between the two countries is solid and growing, and there has been also a very good cooperation on North Korea. So it is not the major issue. South Korea, one could argue, is the sort of natural best friend of Japan in the region. But even here, the relationship is not as smooth as we could imagine. Both are liberal democracies, economically developed and open countries, and both are allies of the United States. However, again, history keeps complicating things even here. Two major historical issues are currently at stake with South Korea. It is the unresolved problem of comfort women. We're talking about the use of Japanese, of Korean women by Japan during its occupation of Korea and military expansion into the Asian continent during war. And of course, the issue of their territorial, again, sovereignty dispute and maritime territorial dispute in the Sea of Japan over the Takeshima Dogdo Islands. Again, we're talking a very small rock island, which is today administered by Korea and claimed by Japan. To complete our tour of Japan's security challenges, we need to, of course, look more closely at China. China's military rise has been, of course, watched with great attention, not just by Japan, but by most of the world. And while the expansion of its military as such is in a way logical and matching its growing global economic footprint and political ambitions, it is the increasingly assertive tone and orientation of Beijing's security policy under President Xi Jinping that has been most worrying Japan and other Chinese neighbors. Whether it is by the way it started to assert its claims in the South China Sea by building up military infrastructure in the disputed waters, or by the use of military intimidation in the case of Taiwan, clashes on the Sino-Indian borders, or the way it's been dealing with Hong Kong or its Uyghur population, there are reasons to think that Chinese peaceful rise may not be as peaceful as it portrays to be. All this resonates very much with Japan, which maintains a very long and complex relationship with its continental neighbor. Here again, the memory of Japan's wartime atrocities is kept well and alive in the Chinese popular culture by the Chinese leadership, feeding the nationalist discourse and anti-Japanese sentiments. Of course, here Japan's historical revisionism does not really help to solve the issue. But more importantly, it resonates in the Japanese context in the case of the disputed sovereignty over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. These are listed by Beijing as part of their core sovereign national interests in the same way as Taiwan or Tibet, and therefore completely non-negotiable. Japan has therefore all the reasons to fear that China might step up its posture and eventually attempt to seize the islands by force if and when the opportunity presents itself. Related to this, and to complete the image of China as a security concern for Japan, it is the overall behavior it has been exhibiting, mostly in the case of the South China Sea, vis-a-vis international law, and international law at sea in particular, which disrespects the basic logic of freedom of navigation and undermines the regional rules-based order. But let's look more closely at the East China Sea dispute. when we mention the East China Sea dispute, we in fact refer to two separate, although closely related disputes. One over the sovereignty of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands themselves, and one of the disputed maritime delimitation that is, of course, related to the sovereignty dispute itself, because whoever owns the islands then shifts the maritime border itself. So when we talk about the China Sea disputes, the disputed area, in fact, covers a much larger chunk of the East China Sea, which is also known to be rich in oil and gas reserves. The islands are today administered by Japan, and they are uninhabited. But the tensions have importantly escalated, especially since September 2012, when Japan decided to nationalize the islands by basically purchasing them from a private owner. Now, by doing that, Japan, in fact, wanted to ensure the preservation of status quo and prevent the purchase of those islands by the then governor of Tokyo, who wanted to build a Coast Guard facility on the islands. The move has been, of course, misinterpreted by China, who perceived it as a change of status quo and started to deploy military vessels and patrols to the region and around those islands. You can see the sharp increase of military activity around those islands precisely beginning September 2012. As another reaction, China unilaterally established an air defense identification zone over all the entire area of the East China Sea in November 2013. In a rather unprecedented move, it basically established a control unilaterally over the airspace over this area. The situation eventually led to a complete disruption of diplomatic ties between China and Japan, which lasted for almost 2 years. Eventually, the two leaders met in November 2014 at the margins of the APEC summit in Vladivostok in what we call a nice-breaking meeting. Well, a good picture speaks 1,000 words, and judging by the expression of these two leaders during this handshake, you can imagine that the tensions between China and Japan are far from over, and there will be a special lecture dedicated only to this topic.